Welcome back to another episode of the Mental Toughness Podcast. This is Matt Phillips, founder of Pro Athlete Advantage, and I am very excited today. I think I'm always excited for these podcasts, but to introduce you to Mark Sanborn. Mark is an international best-selling author, noted expert on leadership, team building, customer service, and change. He has written multiple books, including Fred Factor, Fred 2.0, You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader, among others. And most recently, he published a book called The Potential Principle, which he and I dive into during this podcast. It was such an honor for me to be able to sit with Mark and download information around mental toughness, mindset, leadership that he talks about on a daily basis. Mark travels the world speaking and inspiring and educating audiences. And just to give you some insight into some of his clients, Costco, Hewlett-Packard, Harley-Davidson, FedEx, Cisco, Remax, New York Life, ESPN, he has had the opportunity to impact a tremendous amount of people and companies in his life and continues to do so. I actually know that he is at this time, and he mentions this on the podcast, but building a brand new book that he will launch, I think, here in late 2018. So this is a man who has a passion for inspiring, for motivating, but more importantly, for educating people. And as you're going to see in the potential principle, it's helping get people out of their way. That's why I was so drawn to what Mark talks about. It's about helping people achieve what they want to achieve in this life, how to get to that level of high performance. So he and I had a ton of fun in this podcast talking about all things mindset and leadership, and I know you're going to enjoy it just as much as I did. So as I always say, get out your pens, get out your papers, and get ready to take some notes, because we talk about everything from sales and how to approach that on a daily basis to some key times in his life that really influenced him, people he surrounded himself with. And you're going to learn a lot from this podcast with Mr. Mark Sanborn. Of course, I want to point you, and this will be in the show notes as well, marksanborn.com. Please go check him out. Buy some of his books. They are absolutely incredible. I have read through a couple of his books, including The Fred Factor and The Potential Principle, of course, that we dive into here in the next few minutes. But he's just a man on fire for developing others, and I know that you can learn a lot from Mark Sanborn. Enjoy the podcast. Let me introduce the one and the only Mark Sanborn. Hey, Mark, thank you so much for taking your time today. Just thrilled to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be with you.
Yeah, I was fortunate to meet you probably a month or two ago through a mutual friend, and of course knew of you just based on the numerous books you have written, including The Fred Factor and You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader and Fred 2.0. And then obviously most recently you published The Potential Principle, which I want to spend some time talking about today. But I know you're a busy guy, and hopefully in the Denver area, not flying around the world this week.
No, I'm in Denver today.
Okay, good. I'm catching you at home then, so this is perfect. I'm really anxious to kind of dive into some of the potential principles specifically, because that book is all about high performance. So that's why you and I are so linked. I think we have very similar mindsets around kind of the mental side of things and pushing limits and kind of eliminating those self-limiting beliefs. But where I wanted to start today, Mark, is, when you hear the words mental toughness, right? What, people do you think of? How do you define those words? What pops in your head when you hear mental toughness?
I take a little different look at mental toughness. I think most people think of mental toughness as a response to a difficult situation. The old cliche, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. But see, toughness is about the ability not just to withstand, it's not just about resilience, but it's about the ability to create. Because it takes mental muscle as it takes physical muscle to increase your capacity in life. And so I think that mental toughness isn't just something that serves us when times are tough. I think it serves us well when times aren't tough, but when we can work a little bit harder and a little bit longer and with more focus than our competitors and get ahead. So mental toughness to me is about the capacity to both withstand difficulties as well as to positively exploit opportunities.
And I love that word create, because it's when you're up against any adversity or even something good, it's what are you doing with it, right? How do you approach it most appropriately? And I don't think you and I've talked about this before, but I talk to people all the time about when things are going poorly, two things happen. Either you kind of dig in and, to use your word, create and move out of it, or you take your foot off the gas even more. And when things are going well in your business or personal life, there's two things that can happen. One is you kind of dig in and say, I'm going to leverage this and use it as momentum, or you take your foot off the gas and just start pulling back a little bit. Have you found kind of this similar things in clients you've worked with, and where there's kind of those two responses you typically see?
Sure. Well, there's the withdrawal that you speak of, which can be giving up, and then there's the engagement. But sometimes you use withdrawal to assess or to analyze. Tom Peters 30 plus years ago talked about a bias for action, and like most good ideas, I think sometimes we overdo it and we take them to an extreme. And the problem is, and it's part of what I'm working on now in my next book, part of it is we need to have clarity on what we need to do and how to do it before we do it. Now, sometimes, effort does create momentum. Sometimes you flop around, as I say, in the ocean as you're learning to swim. But it's usually a better strategy to say, what's going on? Why is it going on? And what do I need to do now? So as long as the withdrawal isn't, permanent, and as long as the withdrawal isn't an excuse and a form of giving up, sometimes you just kind of assess what needs to happen. But ultimately, you have to engage. Yes. And if you withdraw too long, that becomes procrastination. I'm up against another book deadline, and I've always turned my books in on time, but I find that if I start working too far in advance on a book, then I don't have kind of the urgency. But then if I wait too long, the urgency becomes anxiety, and that takes away from my ability to create, positively and to do a good job. So there's a lot of dynamics going on, but I think you're right. People tend to either kind of withdraw or they engage, but there is a good form of withdrawal if it's about assessment and strategy and planning.
Yes, I like that. I like the way you describe that, because it's kind of healthy versus unhealthy withdrawal, but ultimately it's about action. One of my mentors always uses the phrase, action eliminates fear, and I think action eliminates feelings of overwhelm. Action eliminates a lot of stuff along the way.
Let me interject. There was a book a few years ago called "Hope Is Not a Strategy," and I beg to differ. I disagree. I think hope is a strategy, depending on how you define hope. I call hope having something new to try and being willing to try it. In other words, you're hopeless if you either don't have anything left to try, or you have something left to try, but you're just not willing to try it. So I think hope is a strategy, but it's more than wishful thinking. It's about having something you can do, and then, like you said, like your mentor taught you, doing it, because that does tend to remove fear. Action tends to reduce, if not eliminate, fear. So I do think hope is a strategy if hope is understood correctly.
Yes, that's very true. It's interesting you talk about your book. Do you, if you look back at your past, because it sounds like you thrive under pressure, right? Not too much pressure, but enough pressure where you've got a deadline looming. So it's a balance. It's always a balance. If as you look back at your kind of growing up, was that something that you've always been that way, where if you have too long, you're just not going to do it, but it's got to be the right amount of pressure, and that's where you thrive?
Oh, I'm not sure. I don't know what percentage is genetic and what percentage is environmental. I'm a firstborn, and even though birth order isn't the end all of what we become, there are certain aspects of it that are pretty stereotypic, and I was always kind of the straight-laced, obedient, organized, turn it in, get it done, do well in school kind of kid. And so that happened at a very young age. But what I did as I got older is, rather than just kind of operate out of autopilot or out of, genetics and predisposition, I started to look at how I operated best when I did things. And it was funny in college, I can still remember. I still have nightmares. I'm almost 60. I still have nightmares that I'm going in to take a final in a class I never attended. So as much as I enjoyed college, it must have been fairly traumatic because I'm still occasionally having these crazy dreams. But I would, during finals, which was, really crunch time for most students, I found that if I read a nonfiction book during finals week, that it helped. And I don't know exactly why, but I guess it kind of broke up the monotony of, what most people do, because they're not real prepared for their finals. So they just, that's where we get the word cram, right? They just try to cram everything into their brain. And what happens is a lot of stuff falls out. And I found that by alternating between studying and then reading a fiction book, did I say, I don't know if I said nonfiction, but a fiction book, that it helped. And so I think the lesson there isn't to read a fiction book when you're under pressure. Right. I think the lesson is to, know thyself, to follow the old adage, so that you can understand the nuances of when you work best, how you work best, and don't be confined by, this kind of, common knowledge. Everybody's wired a little bit differently. And while there's a lot of things that apply to all of us, there are always unique things that apply only to you or to me.
One thing I read in your potential principal book that you mentioned was how you like to go work at coffee shops. That's inspiring, and not just for the caffeine hit, but the environmental factor. When you talk about, knowing thyself and making sure you're positioning yourself in an ideal environment, that you are approaching work a certain way that has worked for you in the past and most likely will continue to help you in the future. That coffee shop thing really stuck out to me. Is that a place where you thrive, and do you just feed off the energy? Do you like working in kind of team environments, or not, but not a team, but just people around you?
Yeah, I think whether it's a coffee shop or it's a restaurant or a bar where even if I'm not drinking alcohol, maybe I'm just having a glass of iced tea, I kind of like the energy of a public place without being distracted by the engagement. When I wrote my first couple books, I wrote them mostly in Starbucks, the one nearest my house. And it kind of backfired, because what happened is people started to recognize me and talk to me. And that was a nice feature for my social life, but a bad aspect of writing. So I find that I have to go places where I'm not known and not recognized if I want to have that, that kind of energy around me, but not the distraction. So that's as best as I can figure why I like, sometimes writing and creating in public spots. Now I have a great office and I do a lot of work here. The other place, and it's mostly by a combination of necessity and opportunity, that I work is on airplanes, because I don't talk to people on airplanes, except to be pleasant. I might say, hi, how are you?
Yes.
Where are you going? That's about the extent of it, because that's truly uninterrupted time for me. And so I do a lot of my focused thinking and work on airplanes, where I don't have to worry about my phone ringing or somebody, walking into my office.
I like that. When I started my business, Mark, I thought it was fascinating because I was trying at the start to work at home, and I've got a home office and all that, and was working at home, and I was just getting nothing done, and I kept getting up and getting a coffee and milling around the house and doing all that stuff. And I quickly realized that, even looking back at my athletic experience and background, like, I always needed to be around a team, and it was, to your point, it was energy. That's what I needed. It wasn't that I was chit-chatting with everybody and a social butterfly, something like that, but it was, I have to be around that energy, because that's where I really, really thrive. And so I'm very similar to you. I go to coffee shops. I now use a co-working space quite a bit, just to feel that energy. And I don't know what those people are doing in the co-working space. I have no idea. But it's all about that energy and that environment. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think it's a huge component of knowing that environment in which you're going to ultimately thrive.
Yeah, I built a gym in my basement because I got tired of driving to the gym. But then after many years, I realized that I still had my best workouts at a gym, not with a partner, but just, again, being around other people and having, dedicated equipment that let me focus. Because, I know there are people that, successfully work out at home. But I think it goes back to really the whole point of the story, and that is, know thyself. Know the best environments that you work in, and then do what you can to create those environments.
Yeah. I love that. One thing that stuck out in your book was these 3 secrets to improving your performance. And the first is performance improves when you enjoy it. The second is dedication and discipline are twins. And the third is remember that the best have already created a path for you. Where I want to start is with the third, actually. That the best have already created a path for you. When you think back when you originally started your career, was there someone or some book that kind of helped you along, that showed you the path that kind of started you out to get where you are today?
Well, the answer would be both. I mean, there were people and there were books, both. I was lucky. My parents both were, my mom was a school teacher and my dad was an avid reader. So I grew up in an environment where I was encouraged to read. I quickly learned to enjoy reading, and I read a lot. And I think that's one of the greatest gifts you can give to your kids. That's why my wife and I, we have a son in high school about to graduate and one in college. But we read to them, I think, every day of their lives when they were little. And I think both of them developed an interest in reading and learning as a result. But as I got into school, I had some teachers, and this was so long ago that we really didn't banter. The word mentor existed, but we didn't use it as commonly as we do today. I was fortunate. I had a couple teachers that took a real active interest in me. And because I responded well to the additional, attention and guidance that they gave me, that helped. And then for me, getting involved in 4-H and FFA, which, at the time were predominantly rural America youth programs. Today, there's as many 4-H and FFA programs in cities as there are in rural America. But that kind of gave me a track to run on. And the first person I can really think of that in retrospect that I thought was a mentor was a guy named we called him Doc Cantner, Dr. Earl F. Cantner, and later a broadcaster named Ed Johnson. And what I found is they like me, I like them, but our interactions were always very purposeful. They were trying to show me how to improve my performance or how to get better at what I was doing or how to plan more effectively. And whenever somebody builds into your life like that, that's a great gift, and we should all, acknowledge and appreciate it. And regrettably, Ed passed away at a very young age, but I've stayed in touch. Doc Cantner is 92, I believe. Wow. And I talk to Doc on a pretty regular basis because I feel like I owe him, as I felt I did my parents, so much gratitude and respect. So, reading, especially reading more than just for amusement. Entertainment's fine. I have nothing against entertainment, but I think we need to read for education as well. And by the way, really well-written novels can increase your learning. I mean, there's been recent research that shows that it expands your vocabulary and often your thinking capacity if you read good fiction. But of course, nonfiction that's specific to what it is you do, or nonfiction that's specific to improving your attitude or your speaking skills or your physical health. Those are all readily available. You don't even have to drive to a bookstore anymore because normally you can access all of that online.
Right. I think that, remember everyone listening, the Mark Sanborn rule, no fiction books unless you're studying for finals. But otherwise there's all joking aside, I think that's phenomenal. Dr. Cantner and Ed Johnson sound like amazing people. And I love the phrase you used, that the conversations were purposeful. There was a meaning to them. There was something knowledge to be passed, or conversations to have. And I think that's so crucial of, when I'm working with business people now too, this kind of having one-on-ones, and different companies call them different things, but your meetings with your direct employees, what a lot of people label one-on-ones. A lot of my conversations honestly are around, like, is that conversation purposeful? Like, what do you want out of it? What value are you providing, and are they providing back, right? And I think that purpose, if that were added more into like a business setting, I just think everybody would benefit unbelievably from that.
Well, we can learn from everyone, even from people who sometimes teach us what not to do. We always think that we can only learn from positive role models, but frankly, negative role models can keep us from doing stupid things as well.
That is very true. The next thing that really stuck out to me was your second point. I'm going in reverse for some reason. But the dedication and discipline are twins. And the way you talk about the dedication is kind of that willingness to do what needs to be done, and discipline is that ability to do what needs to be done even when you don't feel like it. Can you talk a little bit about kind of your learnings around discipline and kind of how you've kind of improved yourself from a discipline perspective over the years, and how people can leverage that today?
Well, if anything, I might have erred a little bit heavily on discipline. Discipline sometimes can make us blind to nuance, and I'll try to explain that in a minute. But basically, if you're dedicated, it's easy to do what needs to be done when you feel like it and when circumstances are good. But discipline kicks in when you don't feel like it. I often say I rarely feel like working out when I wake up in the morning, and yet 6 days out of 7 I work out, and by the end of the workout I'm always glad that I did.
Yes.
And so I think that's really where if you're dedicated to fitness at some level, that dedication won't make you feel all warm and giddy at 6 a.m. in the morning, but discipline will get you into the gym, and by the time you're done, the chemicals are flowing, and the endorphins and endorphins, I should say, and you feel pretty good. I just think that people have a false sense of dedication when they are only dedicated when it's easy. That's the test of dedication: is does it require discipline? Now, when I say sometimes I'm too disciplined, there is always a balance. Aristotle called it the golden mean, and we tend, and Aristotle also suggested we tend to we rarely hit the golden mean. We go too far one side or the other. We become too disciplined, or we become too lackadaisical. We become too committed, or we become too uncommitted. And what happens is you got to intersperse spontaneity with discipline. You've got to be open. If you're too disciplined, and here's the problem: if you're too disciplined, you miss opportunities and you miss nuances. I used to rationalize about working out every day, and I went through some amazing mental gymnastics to exercise 7 days a week, back before I realized that most physiologists will tell you need a recovery day.
Right.
But keep in mind, I wasn't exercising that intensely, and so my discipline to doing it daily took away from the effort that I brought to the workout, which is one of the things I write about in the book is FIT. And that is frequency, intensity, and technique.
Yes.
You got to use all three. And I was big on the frequency, but I wasn't very good on the intensity. I was okay on the technique. And so if you really want to maximize your gains, whether it's at work or in the gym, you've got to do what it will make you better more frequently. You got to do it more intensely, and you have to do it correctly. And so that's why I talk about FIT in the book: frequency, intensity, and technique.
I like that. I mean, I'm curious because you hear about this, especially in the business world, but it seems to be more focused on frequency, meaning FaceTime, time at your desk, time in the office. It's a badge of honor that you've worked 16 to 18-hour days. Is it possible, in your perspective, to have like that intense of a frequency at a supposed really high intensity level throughout that? Is that possible?
Well, lacking technique, you can only increase frequency. So here's the deal. There's one of the great lies in selling is that sales is a numbers game, which is totally untrue. If you don't know how to close the sale, you can make 100 calls a day and you still won't sell anything. Selling is a numbers and skills game. That is to say, you've got to develop the skills to close a sale and then get in front of more people who can buy from you. So what I say is that leaders that do not increase their capacity, that's the ability to produce results, only get ahead by increasing the number of hours they work, and there is a dead end. There is an eventual dead end to how many hours you can work. So, it's not about the input. It's not about the number of hours. It's about the output. And I know some leaders that work fewer hours and get more done. That putting in the time and I've often said, short-term imbalance is sometimes required to achieve long-term balance. But I work with a lot of leaders who stay imbalanced over the long run. And that's an example of not increasing their ability to produce results by focusing on frequency and not technique and intensity as well.
Mm. I like that. What's one thing that they could do to kind of increase that technique side of things, to kind of shift to output?
Well, I'll give you a technique you can use to increase your results, and it's out of my book, You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader, and that is, ask yourself, the 193 different things you do every day, what are the 6 to 8 things you do that give you the biggest payback on your investment of time and expertise? I call them MVP activities, for most valuable and profitable. Mm-hmm. In other words, what are the things that create results? Most things we do every day create activity, but not accomplishment. We do lots of things that eventually have to be done, but they really don't accomplish anything. They just kind of keep us, at baseline. So ask yourself, what are the 6 to 8 most valuable and profitable activities, the 6 to 8 things you do? We're talking behaviors every day that give you the biggest return on your investment of time. And then the second part of that is schedule 60 to 80% of every day to do them. And the only reason I don't say 100% is that's impossible. I'm still giving my clients in this challenge, I'm still giving them 20 to 40% of every day to deal with phone calls, crises, urgencies, interruptions. But if you could just focus 60 to 80% and actually get, like when I'm writing a book, I'm very timely. I sent out an email to my team last week and I said, here are the things I'm open to in the next month. Everything else is off my agenda, because I've got to focus on writing a book. You can't write a book in between interruptions. You really have to do some serious thinking and some serious creating. So I've kind of cleared my plate of the non-essentials. Now, there are things I'm going to have to do that come up, but I'm not going to schedule distractions, which is something we often end up doing when we don't understand the difference between activity and accomplishment.
That is a fabulous point. I love that. I'm writing copious notes here.
Just go out and buy all my books, and all this stuff's in there.
I know, right? Yeah. It's the podcast where I don't say anything because I'm taking notes the whole time. That's a good podcast then. I know we've only got a couple minutes left, Mark. I want to be just be very aware of your time, so we end right when we need to. What is, you think back, because, as entrepreneurs, as business leaders, we're constantly faced with, these, a lot of times, self-limiting beliefs, right? And worried about kind of that baseline, the word you just used. And you were talking in your book about the Pygmalion effect. I'm probably saying that wrong, but that reveals that higher expectations lead to better performance. And ultimately, we all limit ourselves. What's one kind of tip or bit of advice that could help people kind of eliminate some of those limiting beliefs that we all carry around with us?
Many years ago, a guy named Richard Bach wrote a book that sold like 1 trillion copies called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I think it was in the 70s, and we were really kind of just coming out of peace, love, and blacklight posters. But it was actually an interesting book. It kind of looked at life at a more philosophical level through the eyes of this seagull and freedom, etc. But the reason that I bring that up is because Bach said if you argue for your limitations, they become yours. And I see people doing that all the time. I mean, it's one thing to be realistic about your abilities and your capabilities, but don't argue for limitations. Instead of saying I can't do that, just say that's not a skill I've developed yet. Or instead of saying that's just the way I am, say, I need to change that way that I am. And I think I talk a little bit in The Potential Principle about Carol Dweck's book, where she talks about the growth mindset.
Yes.
The fixed mindset says, I am what I am and I can't change it, which, when you think about it, it's kind of silly. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like saying I'm sitting in my living room and I can't go to my dining room, because I'm in my living room.
Right.
But a lot of people actually believe that their abilities are innate and there's nothing they can do to change or improve them. The growth mindset simply says, you may not become an NBA player, but you can learn to shoot better free throws.
Mm-hmm.
You may not become a professional golfer, but you can increase your drives. You may not become a writer, but you can write better emails. And so the growth mindset is really important because it flies in the face of that's just the way I am. So be honest, don't exaggerate your abilities, but don't argue for your limitations. If someone pays you a compliment, this is where you see people arguing for their limitations. If someone pays you a compliment, don't argue against it. If somebody says, "Hey, Bill, I like those shoes," say, "Oh, these shoes, yeah, I don't usually wear them. I'm not big on them." Like, what's the point? I'm trying to give a superficial example because it's a superficial response. Simply say thank you, acknowledge it. Now, if somebody's trying to blow smoke up your skirt, then, know the difference. I'm not talking about the manipulative players. I'm just talking about don't diminish yourself. And when you start doing that, it'll give you a stronger base to launch from.
Mm. That's fabulous advice. Don't argue for your limitations. Accept it, move on. I love it. Mark, I know I got to wrap up, my friend. So we're going to wrap up. I will have links to the potential principle of Fred Factory. You don't need a title to be a leader. Fred 2.0, a couple other books in the notes of this podcast for everyone listening. And please check out Mark. Fabulous website, fabulous speaker. You can hire him for your next event and bring leadership, like true leadership, and to your conference or company. So Mark, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me, and look forward to connecting again.
Oh, Matt, my pleasure. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.